You've been given the privilege of being the last submitter on day 2 of week 3 in the afternoon shift.
Graveyard shift.
I didn't want to call it that, but it's something like that. We've got your submission in front of us, and we've got a bit of time here. I think we got you down for 3:40 to 4:30, I think is the time.
I don't think we'll need that long.
Okay.
Yeah, but thank you. So, tēnā koutou katoa, ka au te awa, ko te awa ko au, ko Nick Jones, tōku angoa. And I referred to that whakatauki about the indivisibility of people and water, not only because it was quoted in our first tank report back in 2014, but because it also aligns with the public health concept of waiora and human health and the health of the environment not being able to exist without each other. Ki uta, ki tai. So that's just really by way of introduction. My role is I'm the clinical director for population health at the District Health Board. I'm also a medical officer of health under the Health Act and a drinking water enforcement officer under that Health Act. I'm not going to go through the 25 or so submission points in our submission. I just want to focus in really on 3 main areas that I want to highlight. So the first really is around plan monitoring and review, and we made some submission points on several aspects, several provisions in this regard. The Objective 4 and I think Policy 35 it was, and the hearing report recommended rejecting both those submission points on the grounds that reviews required by the Act and that a framework has been established by the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management 2020. But our submission was based on the view that in this case the statutory framework probably shouldn't be relied upon. Plan Change 9 relies quite heavily upon best practice and non-regulatory approaches, particularly in relation to land use and impact on water quality. And given the time frame between when we started first reviewing this plan change, which is close to 10 years ago now, there seems to us a real danger that it could be another 20 years before alternative approaches or provisions are developed, should the Plan Change 9 approach prove to be ineffective. So given that, we thought it was useful to have a trigger for an earlier review, and that was the purpose of our submission on Objective 4 and Policy 35. So just to refer you to, that's recommendation 5 of our submission, and also recommendation 11 on page 3. The second point, which is very obviously closely linked to public health, is around source water protection. And I don't know, many of you, I'm sure most of you will recall the events of 2016. We had, well, by best estimate, the most recent data we have is around 7,500 people made sick with Campylobacter in Havelock North. And certainly one of the findings of the government's inquiry was that it was in fact a failure or a weakness in that first barrier, which is the protection of source water, that contributed. So both before and since that time, we have been working very closely alongside colleagues in the Regional Council and the District Council in a working group that was established under the auspices of the government inquiry to develop a number of processes around information sharing and assurance, but particularly more recently in the context of TANK, to provide a set of provisions that would be included around source water protection in Plan Change 9. So I mean, there's already been one submission. You'll recall the chair of that group came along and presented in Toi Toi a while back. But I just want to focus in on the specifics that we have in the District Health Board's submission. And they concern Objective 9, Policy 6, and two sections of the schedule around farm management plans, Schedule 30. So I'll just go through those. In terms of Objective 9, so that's Recommendation 6, we were concerned that the wording of that objective doesn't match the requirements of the National Environmental Standard, the regulations for drinking water sources, which require that the council are required to not issue consents or have rules around, what's the name of the rules? I'll remember in a second. Essentially where there is the risk of increasing the level of contamination above where it is at with existing treatment levels. So the point is that the NES actually does require, I'll find the wording here. It mustn't allow a grant a water permit or discharge permit for an activity that will occur upstream of an abstraction point where the drinking water concern meets the health criteria if the activity is likely to introduce or increase the concentration of any determinants in the drinking water so that after existing treatment it no longer meets the health quality criteria. So anyway, the point of that is that there does need to be something, I think, in the plan that actually refers back to the NES and the requirement. Essentially, you don't want a situation where an activity is permitted that requires the drinking water supplier to then have to introduce new treatment methods or potentially have to find an alternative drinking water source because there are no alternative methods. The second one around source water protection was around Policy 6, and that is Recommendation 10 of our submission. So that really comes down to the requirement for source water protection zones to be applied to all registered water suppliers serving 25 persons or more. And I'd point you to both the government's inquiry and to the Ministry for the Environment's review of the National Environmental Standard for Sources of Human Drinking Water. That's a report that came out in 2018, I believe. So the Ministry for the Environment has conducted a review of the NES. Obviously, we haven't seen the revised NES come out yet for submissions, but one assumes that having found an issue with the existing NES, that they will promulgate a change. And so this one highlights one of the issues being that the current NES, the policies 7, 8 and 10 don't apply to water supplies between 25 and 500. And that was certainly also concluded by the government's inquiry to be a problem. So we have recommended, as has the Joint Working Group, that that Policy 6 be extended to cover persons, water suppliers, 25 persons or more. And in your submission, you'll see some of the water supplies that would potentially be affected and who currently would not get protections of the provisions of the source water protection zones. Then coming to the farm management plans, farm environmental plans, which is recommendations 14 and 15 of our submission on page 5. It just seemed an omission not to give council the scope to consider whether the farm environmental plan was going to provide protection from contamination of the source water for drinking water. This certainly seems to be the intention of PC9 is to provide protection of drinking water sources, and my understanding is that farm environmental plans are required to take some notice of the fact that they have got water sources downstream from them, but it just seems an omission that though that Schedule 30 doesn't actually specifically refer to those matters for consideration. So we've recommended that, for example, you add an additional bullet point there under section B 3.1, which says that they can take into account the effectiveness of the measures proposed to prevent water sources getting contaminated. So then that's really most of the issues as far as source water protection is concerned. Well, I guess probably related to that is a matter that we did a further submission to the District Council's plan, and that is in relation to the source water protection zones, the method and the maps that have been used. And the District Health Board has taken the view that we should be taking the conservative approach and combining the two methods into a combined source water protection zone. And then moving on to water quantity, we have submitted on objective 16 and 18 around prioritisation for water allocation and the whole process of quantity. I haven't had a chance to look through all of the Section 42 reports and Section 42 addendums, but my sense is that the rejection was on the grounds that there were other objectives that covered what we were seeking in our submission. But I think it may have missed the point slightly in that under tank objective 18, sorry, it's 18, I think we have been partially accepted actually, in that it's giving effect to the national policy statement. But under 16, I'm not sure that it's captured the point that it's really around the allocation of water, where that life-supporting capacity and the sustainability of water really does need to be taken into account. And I think that really aligns with the whole Te Mana o Te Wai concept and the priority needing to be allocated to the water body itself. And so when you're making allocative decisions, it seems to us that you do need to include in that prioritisation process some recognition of Te Mana o Te Wai. And then I think there's one specific question which we raised around this issue of reasonable and actual versus maximum quantity. And I'm just trying to find where was that. I'll come back to you, I'll let you know where that actually was. It's one of our submission points, but it's around policy 37. Yes, sorry. Yeah. Policy 37, our recommendation 12. Yeah, the clarify the point D1. And look, my apologies if Council has since modified its submission, its draft plan. I've seen 2 or 3 draft plans, and I've had a little bit of trouble keeping up with what the latest one is. So I'm working off the April one, but there may have been changes. So the point being, though, that we're concerned that there doesn't seem to be any taking into account the duration over a year in which irrigation or water takes might be used. So we know, for example, that grape growers don't use a lot of their allocation. They may only use it for a few days or a few, a week or two of the year, and a land user might decide because of market conditions that they want to change to a different land use. And it just seems to me that cumulative effect of multiple people moving to use their water allocation for longer periods of time over the year, ultimately, for example, say switching to a water bottling facility, that could have quite a big multiplicative effect in terms of increasing the total use. So I'm not a planner, so I can't really give you the exact wording around how I think that needs to be managed, but I'm just raising that as an issue. And it's up for me.
Thank you. See if we've got any questions.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jones. Can I just take you to your table 1, please?
Yes.
So, of those, Porongahau, Waimarama, Tuai I don't think are anywhere near the tank catchments. Where's Farm Road, please?
Good point. This was a Hawke's Bay wide table.
Sure.
Yes. I can't tell you Farm Road off the top of my head. Omahu obviously is
Yes.
in the tank, as is Whakatu. But I will have to get back to you on that. One of my colleagues from Hastings District Council might be able to inform us. But
Okay, thank you.
is it Waipukurau? Okay.
My other question is, of these smaller water supplies, what proportion of them are from surface water rather than groundwater? So is a community such as Tuai or Porongahau, I'll choose 2 outside tank, do you know if they're groundwater or surface water fed?
Porongahau is a groundwater. Tuai, you got me there. I think it might be a combination, but I'm not sure. I'd have to get back to you.
In terms of source protection, what's the practical difference? What are the practical differences between a catchment supplying water to a sizable community from surface water, and often those are difficult to secure, versus groundwater? So in particular, what are the requirements in relation to surface water supplies for source protection zones?
Well, I think the difference is the nature of the source protection zone itself. Obviously extends a long way upstream of the water take. The NES is quite neutral on whether it's a groundwater take or a surface water take. So if the activity is being carried out upstream or up gradient of the take in such a way that it would introduce levels of contaminants above the current levels, then it is still not permitted. So, for example, if someone had a feedlot or some kind of intensive operation on a riverbank, maybe 1 kilometre or even further upstream from a take, it might be something that would be covered under the NES policies 7, 6 and 7, or 7 and 8, sorry.
And is there still a presumption that surface water takes need more treatment than groundwater takes as a general rule? Sediment, chlorination, etc., etc.
The principle is that the level of treatment needs to match the risk. So under the new Water Services Bill, and to some extent already under Part 2A of the Health Act, is the principle of a public health risk management plan, or now called a water safety plan, which looks at what all the risks are to that water supply, including sources, and applies the appropriate treatment level to it. We're in a stage of evolution in terms of that, and water safety plans for smaller supplies have not been universally applied. The priority of the Ministry of Health was to focus on the larger supplies first. And so I couldn't say to you now that necessarily all risks, particularly for smaller supplies, have already been taken into account in terms of the water treatment systems that are operating. In any case, though, the idea is that the NES provides a framework by which regional councils can provide another barrier, because any water treatment system can fail. And so you can have failures in the reticulation, you can have failures in the treatment steps, you can have failures in the catchment. And it's the accumulation of those multiple approaches that ensures the water remains safe. I'm not sure whether I've answered your question, but I think in general terms it's a different shaped source protection zone, but the same provisions need to apply.
Thank you.
If Plan Change 9 was changed to service the 25 persons criteria versus the 500, what do you have a feel for how many additional entities or groups of people that would take in?
It depends a little bit where we land with the Water Services Bill. At the moment, registration is, there are requirements on registration under Part 2A of the Health Act if you are what's deemed a community purpose building or a community purpose supply. The Ministry of Health has had a policy not requiring registration of supplies serving less than 100, I believe. So it's certainly possible that Taumata ROI could extend that requirement around registration to smaller, considerably smaller communities, potentially small papakainga of 30, 40 people, who would then, I guess, come under this this protection as introduced under PC9. I think, though, that when you look at the provisions that PC9 proposes for those supplies that don't have a defined source protection zone, they're fairly minimal. There's not an extensive requirement on land users. There is a requirement for them to take into account or to understand and to communicate with their drinking water supplier who's downstream from them. But it's not like they're going to have to rush off and get a whole lot of consents. So I think you need to look at the total package, around what does that actually mean. Yes, we have the big source protection zones, that will be notified and included by Napier City and Hastings District Council and some of their smaller supplies as well. But in terms of the widespread application of source protection zones, I think it's about what is required for those smaller ones. And I don't think it's a huge ask.
Thank you. Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Jones. We didn't have any further questions. Thanks very much.
Kia ora.
That's our last submission for the day. For tomorrow, we've got Hastings District Council and Napier City Council for the morning, and then we have a break for lunch, and then Hawke's Bay Regional Council responses. Thought it's a good time to have a chat about those responses in terms of how you're thinking they might be given. We'd certainly, and we'll have this conversation very shortly, our preference is to have something in writing, either tomorrow or if it was a verbal presentation following that would be helpful to us as a panel, but I had some discussion on that.
Intending to give you both,
Fantastic.
a verbal presentation and a written.
That's great, that would be most helpful.
Will follow what we're speaking to.
And I just had a couple of more matters, and they've just been from the last couple of days. One was we had forest and bird submissions yesterday, and they were particularly identifying the NCI and the Habitat Quality Index, I think it was. And we'd asked, actually it was Commissioner Cowie asked the question about how does that fit into the planning framework, and it was something that I put to mind last night, and it didn't seem obvious to me in terms of how it fitted within the MPSFM and the planning framework. So I just wondered whether you had a mind of a view in that regard, whether it fits or not. And that's something you can think about for tomorrow.
I'll give that some consideration, thank you.
The other one is the matter of FMUs, and we understand in the background there's been some work, and there is some work in that regard, and so an update would be helpful to us in terms of where you're in the process of identifying FMUs as they apply to proposed plan change 9 and the Hawke's Bay, and in particular timing of that.
Would you like that now? I can give it to you now, or I can talk
Yes,
to that
actually,
tomorrow.
if you can do that now, that would be helpful. Thank you.
So with regard to the FMUs, we are presenting a paper to our Regional Planning Committee, which is being held on the 7th of July. The papers should be made publicly available this Thursday evening, so they'll be available on our website, and we can certainly provide the panel with a copy of that specific paper. We are presenting some options to our Regional Planning Committee for them to consider. We have traversed what FMUs are and delved into what the NPSFM is requiring of us as a regional council. So we did that a couple of months ago in a workshop just to raise their awareness and understanding of what we are embarking on through the paper. So I couldn't preempt what the decision to that will be, but we are presenting them with 3 different options for the region, which will obviously incorporate the tank catchment.
Just in terms of where you are in the process, is that something that's already included engagement with tangata whenua and the community? In terms of the options,
no,
or
this is what
this
we
is a
are developing as
precursor to that
exactly
engagement?
as
Okay.
part of kotahi.
Yes.
So no, we haven't had those conversations specifically with tangata whenua or our communities. So what we're endeavouring to achieve from the 7th of July is effectively an in-principle decision so that we can then engage with our communities and tangata whenua on where the RPC feel comfortable with delineating the FMUs for the region.
So with that in mind, that sounds like you're quite early in the process, looking at
Correct.
options, getting a feel in principle from the governance, and then going out for the engagement with tangata whenua and the community, and then and as a result of that, coming back to the council, getting a firmer decision, and then developing visions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Okay. Thanks for that. That's very helpful. Thank you. Was there any questions on that? The other one was, this is probably more from my understanding. My understanding is that proposed plan change 9 isn't dealing directly with gravel extraction, and those are currently dealt with by Rule 73 and 74 and other parts of the plan, and it wasn't intended there's going to be any amendments to those. So that's more of a clarification. That's my understanding.
Yes.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
correct.
And then the last one was just, this has been a recurring theme, and it's something we'll ponder over. Currently, the Section 42A addendum report has made those small changes to the actual and reasonable, particularly in regards changing from average to maximum. And you would have heard some of my questions, I think, was to the low corporation, but others just in regards to if we were of a view that a maximum might be appropriate to deal with dry season, particularly dry spells during the dry season, and looking at those maximums of those years where it's been particularly dry, and there's been at least 2 of those, does that then create a headroom, like you could foresee that perhaps addresses quite a specific and narrow issue, but then it creates a headroom for that may become the new average. Mm-hmm. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts in regards to that, the checks and balances that might be required there.
So I think we'll address that tomorrow in our closing.
I'm sure you were going to. Thank you. Did we have any other burning matters? That's all for us.
I guess the other one that has been raised is the replacement of policies 5 parts of 5.3 to 5.7, I think the numbers are. I did do, when I first read the proposed plan change, I did have a quick look, but I didn't have a comprehensive look. So I'd just like some quick reassurance that what's in there doesn't, how can I put it, detract at all from the existing policies in the regional plan, because as I read it, generally the tank policies were more rigorous, or the proposed tank policies were quite a bit more rigorous and robust and demanding on consent applicants, particularly in terms of assessment criteria and particularly in terms of the general nature of the policies. So I'd just like some, I don't know, a one-pager that gives me some reassurance on that. It doesn't have to be tomorrow, I just want to make sure.
And just while we're talking, I can also confirm that TANK is not proposing to change the RPS, so the RPS will still apply.
Sorry, the RRMP,
Oh,
I should
yeah.
say. Sorry, my apologies. I always get these things mixed up in my head.
And we were planning to discuss that in our closing statement tomorrow, so we
Okay,
can discuss
thank
it
you.
tomorrow. And,
That's
yeah.
great. Thank you.
With response to a question that we were unable to answer about the rollovers,
Yes.
I think we were a bit confused and we wanted to confer with our resource consent colleagues. And so we'll still want to do that, but I just want to say that I understand that most of the consents are on hold
That's right.
while this plan change is in process before we get a decision on the plan change. However, there were some rollovers that were rolled over for a short period of time with the understanding that this plan change was coming through. We don't know the number of those rollovers. I understand it's a small part of the approximately 600 resource consents, but we can't confirm the number yet. So we'll check that with our resource consent colleagues and we'll get back to you tomorrow.
So they would be for 3 or 4 years only with the...
We think so, yes.
So some
Yep.
numbers and certainty around that would
Yeah,
be helpful.
we're a
for us.
bit vague
When you
on
say
the
small
answers.
number,
Yeah, I know we're a bit
it's all
vague on the
relative.
answers. That's why we
I think
didn't.
small number is
Yeah.
less than half a dozen, but you might think small is 20 to 50.
And
So
that's why we're a bit cautious about answering, because we need to get the details
if you can
before we
get more
get back
detail,
to you.
that'd be
Yep.
helpful. Okay. Just see if was there anything else? No. That was all from our side. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We're going to adjourn for the day. We're back 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. We'll be hearing from Hastings District Council and Napier City Council for the morning. Thanks, everybody.